Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
You still live off us, unlike your brother. That's what my dad said, loudly, like he wanted the words to bounce off the walls and stain the memory of that Sunday forever. The roast was barely carved, the wine had just started flowing, and there he was, chest puffed out like he'd just delivered a punchline that would earn him some applause. Instead, all he got was silence. Except for my mom, of course, who made that soft clucking noise she always did. The one that pretended to be disapproval, but was really just her way of encouraging him to keep going. I sat there for a second, fork frozen halfway to my mouth. My brother Ryan smirked into his whiskey like this was just another one of Dad's dinner speeches. And maybe it was, but this time, something in me snapped. Not in a dramatic throw-the-plate kind of way. No, it was a quiet snap. The kind you only hear inside your chest, like a wire giving way under too much weight. I wiped my mouth with my napkin, reached into my purse, and pulled out an envelope I had printed and sealed the night before. I placed it gently on the table in front of my dad and said as calmly as I could, "That's interesting because this says I paid your mortgage for the last 6 months." Nobody moved. The only sound in the room was the distant hum of the dishwasher and my father's breathing, which suddenly sounded too loud, like he was trying to inhale his pride back into his lungs. He didn't open the envelope, didn't even touch it, just stared at it like it was written in a language he didn't recognize. My mother went pale, her lips parted in a tiny gasp. Ryan stopped smirking. Now, I didn't do it to embarrass him. I really didn't. The truth is, I never intended for them to know. I was content being the silent support beam, holding up the house from behind the drywall, but something about that moment, the smugness in his voice, the unspoken worship of Ryan, the assumption that I was some freeloader floating through life on their exhausted generosity, made me realize I had allowed this narrative to grow wild and unchecked for too long. He didn't say another word all evening, not one, and that somehow felt louder than anything he could have shouted. The rest of the meal passed in a surreal sort of haze. I don't even remember if I finished my plate. I just remember the looks, my mother's tight, trembling mouth as she passed the potatoes like nothing had happened. Ryan's sideways glances like he wanted to say something but didn't dare, and my dad staring into his green beans like they held the answers to the questions I had just forced him to ask himself. Here's what nobody at that table knew. I had started paying their mortgage when I found out they were about to default on it. It wasn't some grand gesture. There was no moment of praise or recognition I was chasing. My mom had called me in tears one night, quietly admitting they were in trouble, that the money was tight, and Paul, she still calls him that when she's scared, wasn't willing to admit how bad it was. She begged me not to tell him, said it would break his spirit. I figured fine, let the man keep his pride. I had the means, I could help. So I set up the payments, quietly, consistently, because that's what you do for the people who raised you, right? But to sit there, hearing him mock me for being the dependent one, while my name had been the only reason that roof still stood over their heads. That flipped some switch I didn't even know existed in me. I had spent so long tiptoeing around my father's ego that I didn't realize how much of my own self-respect I had lost in the process. You ever been in a situation where you were helping someone in silence, giving your time, your money, your energy, only for them to throw your name under the bus anyway? I want to know what you did. Did you blow up like a firecracker or swallow it like I did all those other times? When the dinner finally ended, I stood up, gathered my things, and walked to the door without looking back. My mom tried to follow me, but I told her not tonight. I needed space. I needed air, the kind of air that didn't smell like disappointment roasted with rosemary. I drove back to my apartment in near silence, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into the corners of the car. Somewhere between the freeway and my neighborhood, the tears came, but not the sobbing kind. Just quiet drops that kept falling no matter how many times I blinked. I wasn't sad. Not exactly. It felt more like something inside me had been dislodged. Like a bone finally popping out of a socket it had been jammed in for years. Painful, sure, but maybe necessary. Funny thing is, I didn't expect an apology. I didn't expect gratitude either, but I did expect something. A flicker of recognition, a moment of truth. I didn't get it. And just when I thought the silence was going to be the end of it, Ryan texted me the next morning. It said, "Wait, you paid their mortgage? When were you planning on telling us?" I stared at the screen for a while, wondering if he actually meant us or just me, wondering if this was the start of a conversation or the beginning of a war. I didn't answer Ryan's text. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew the second I opened my mouth, or my keyboard, it would unravel into something I couldn't control. Instead, I let it sit there, buzzing quietly on the nightstand, like a dying wasp, while I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the muffled noise of the city, trying to break through my windows. It wasn't that I didn't want to explain myself. It was that I had already done so 100 times over in my head. Explained it, rationalized it, defended it. The trouble was, no one had ever asked before. It had started on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just finished up a late client call, and I was halfway through reheating some sad leftover pasta when my phone rang with Mom's name flashing across it. She never called that late unless something was wrong. I picked up, already bracing for a hospital visit, or maybe a car accident. But her voice was soft, quiet in a way that made me sit down before she even got to the point. She said, "Julia, I need your help, but you can't tell your father." My stomach dropped before she even said the rest. Turns out they were 3 months behind on the mortgage. Paul, Dad, had made a couple of risky investments through some friend of his, and when those went south, instead of admitting he was in over his head, he doubled down and started moving money around like it was a shell game. They'd pulled from savings, then from their retirement accounts, and when that wasn't enough, Mom started pawning jewelry in secret, trying to keep up appearances. The bank had already sent a warning, and they were one missed payment away from a full-blown foreclosure notice. The part that really got me was how embarrassed she sounded, like it was her failure to carry, like she had to protect him even as the house they'd built together was actively collapsing underneath them. At first, I was angry, furious really, not at her, but at him, because of course he hadn't asked for help. Of course he hadn't told me. That would have meant admitting he wasn't the patriarchal titan he'd always pretended to be. I asked if Ryan knew, and there was this long pause before she said, "No, he's going through a rough time right now. You know how he is with stress." Right, I knew exactly how Ryan was with stress. He handed it off like a hot plate to anyone nearby. Usually me. That night, I didn't even think it through. I logged into my bank, pulled up the bill pay section, and set up the payments. 6 months. I figured that would give them time to get back on their feet or figure out a long-term plan. I never intended it to be permanent. It was just a patch, a band-aid, a quiet kindness that didn't need to be spoken aloud. At least that's what I told myself then. But sitting there now, in the aftermath of that dinner, I realized that what I'd done had turned into more than a band-aid. It had become a shield. A way for my dad to keep living in his fantasy that he was still in control. And while I'd been holding up the walls of their house, he was sitting at his head of the table throne, making declarations like I was some dependent child crashing on their couch and draining their fridge. It was laughable, if it hadn't been so cruel. I got up to clear my head and started rummaging through my old filing cabinet, the one I hadn't touched in at least 2 years. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just chasing a feeling. Among the papers and dusty manila folders, I found a box I hadn't seen in ages. It was labeled college stuff, in my neat handwriting. I pulled it out and popped it open, expecting old transcripts or maybe some forgotten essays. Instead, I found letters, dozens of them, some from friends, some from professors, and one near the bottom that stopped me cold. It was from my grandmother, written the summer before she passed. The paper was brittle, yellowing at the edges, but her handwriting was still strong. She wrote about how proud she was of me, how I reminded her of herself, and then, tucked into the last paragraph, was a sentence that made my breath catch. I told your mother the college fund was for you, and only you. I hope she didn't split it with Ryan like she mentioned. I read it again and again. The meaning didn't change. I sat there for a long time, the letter open in my lap. Thinking back to that conversation in high school, when I found out Ryan's tuition had been fully covered and mine was going to need some loans and a little hustle, as my dad had put it. At the time, I thought maybe they'd hit a rough patch, or maybe they just didn't have enough saved. I never questioned it. I took on the loans, I worked 3 jobs, and Ryan coasted. Somehow he always coasted. I called Tessa, my best friend since college, and asked if she could meet for lunch the next day. She didn't ask why, just said, "I'll be there," the way she always does when my voice drops below a certain register. We met at our usual spot, a quiet cafe that didn't rush you out after the check. And when I told her everything, she didn't even blink. "You need to look at the full financial picture," she said, stirring her iced tea like she was preparing a spell. "If they hid that from you, what else did they sign in your name?" That question hung in the air between us. It sounded paranoid, maybe even ungrateful. But I'd learned something in that moment. Flashbacks don't lie. You can pretend your childhood was fair and functional all you want, but the facts have a way of catching up with the story you were told. And once they do, it's like putting on glasses after years of squinting. Everything suddenly makes a lot more sense and a lot more hurt. I went home that night and pulled my credit report. I wasn't even sure what I expected to find. But what I did find knocked the wind out of me. There was a loan, a business line of credit taken out 5 years ago. My name was on it. I had never signed for anything like that. And just like that, dinner wasn't the biggest problem anymore. I didn't sleep that night, not even a little. I lay in bed, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan above me, its blades motionless in the still air, as if the entire world had taken a collective breath and decided to hold it indefinitely. My thoughts weren't racing exactly. They were marching, slow and deliberate, like soldiers in heavy boots, each one landing with a dull thud in the pit of my stomach. The numbers on the loan didn't lie. There it was, black and white, neatly itemized on my credit report. $64,000 of a business line tied directly to my name, my social security number, and my future. I had never seen a dime of it, never been asked, never signed a damn thing, and yet it sat there like a ticking bomb wrapped in paperwork. I couldn't stop imagining the scenario over and over again. My dad, seated at his worn-out desk in the study that smelled like old cigars and dust, pen in hand, forging my name with the same ease he used to sign my permission slips in elementary school. Maybe my mom stood nearby, wringing her hands, biting her lip, saying nothing but not stopping him either. Or maybe it wasn't that dramatic. Maybe it was just numbers typed into a box and applications submitted online. A quiet little theft dressed up as family necessity. When the sun finally rose, I still hadn't moved. My phone buzzed again, another text from Ryan, short and frustratingly vague. "Julia, we need to talk. There's stuff you don't understand." Stuff I don't understand? The audacity of that line almost made me laugh. I understood plenty. I understood that someone had stolen my credit. I understood that I had been the safety net everyone fell into without ever bothering to check if I was already sinking. I understood that the narrative of me being the one who couldn't quite get it together was a damn convenient cover for everyone else's messes. I eventually dragged myself out of bed and into the living room, where the bookshelf my dad helped me build years ago was leaning slightly to the right, one of its legs warped from the last time I moved. I stared at it, remembering the day we put it together, both of us sweating in the late summer heat, cursing at the instructions, laughing over bent nails and uneven boards. It was one of the rare good memories, the kind that made you question everything when the rest turned to ash. I crouched down, reached behind the bottom shelf, and felt around until my fingers brushed a small wooden box wedged between the back panel and the wall. I pulled it out like it was radioactive. Inside were a few keepsakes I'd forgotten about, old ticket stubs, a couple of faded Polaroids from college, and a flash drive I hadn't seen in years. I plugged it into my laptop, and it booted up with a series of folders I'd named with dumb jokes and inside references I could barely remember. But in one folder labeled WTF taxes, I found scans of old documents, stuff from the year I helped my parents file jointly after Dad's hand surgery, stuff from when Ryan was between jobs, and they begged me to help clean up some of the IRS mess. There, buried deep, was the signature line on the loan paperwork. Scanned, highlighted. My name, but not my handwriting. I knew every loop and line of my signature. This one had been copied, maybe traced, maybe even printed. I forwarded the documents to my friend Mark, a tax attorney I'd met through Tessa a few years back, and asked if he had time to talk. Within the hour, he was calling me, his tone cautious but serious. "Julia," he said, "this isn't just sketchy, this is fraud. If you didn't authorize this, and your name is tied to it, you have grounds for a criminal complaint." That word, criminal, hit me like a punch to the sternum, not because I hadn't considered it, but because hearing it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. My father, the man who taught me how to drive, how to tie my shoes, who bought me my first toolkit, because every woman should know how to fix her own damn shelf, had signed my name to a business loan without my knowledge. That wasn't bad judgment. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was illegal. I didn't respond right away. I closed the laptop, got up, and paced the apartment like something caged. I kept thinking of all the times I'd heard my dad talk about integrity, about doing things the right way, about how today's generation didn't understand hard work or accountability. I remembered his speeches, his smug little monologues at every birthday, every holiday, every chance he got to reassert his moral superiority, and all the while, he'd been lying. Not just to me, but about me. He'd let me be the punchline at the dinner table while pocketing my credit score behind my back. Later that evening, I called Tessa again. She didn't say "I told you so," even though she probably wanted to. Instead, she said, "You need to dig deeper. This isn't the kind of mistake people make once. This is the kind of thing they practice." She wasn't wrong. It felt less like a slip-up and more like a pattern. A strategy executed in small, quiet betrayals. So I dug. I went through old emails, banking statements, tax returns. The more I looked, the more I realized how often my name had been casually folded into family problems without my knowledge, co-signatures that never got explained, authorizations I never gave. I had been the backup plan for years, only I hadn't known I was playing the part. It wasn't just that they leaned on me, it was that they expected me not to notice, or worse, to stay quiet once I did. That night, I sat on the floor next to that broken bookshelf and cried, not because of the loan or the betrayal or the lies, but because I realized I had spent most of my adult life trying to earn respect from people who saw me as a utility. I was the emergency fund they didn't have to replenish. I was the quiet daughter who wouldn't ask questions. And somewhere along the way, I had learned to think that made me strong. But strength without boundaries isn't strength, it's servitude. And I was done serving people who only saw my value when it was convenient. The next day, I opened Ryan's text again, read it one more time, and typed back, "There's stuff I understand better than you think, and it's time we start talking for real." I hit send and stared at the screen, waiting. When the 3 little dots popped up, I felt the tension climb in my chest like a pressure gauge rising fast. I knew that conversation was going to change everything. I just didn't know yet whether it would blow up our family or finally set me free. Ryan showed up the next evening, earlier than I expected, and without warning. I had just stepped out of the shower when the buzzer echoed through my apartment like a siren I hadn't braced for, and when I opened the door in a sweatshirt and damp hair, he was already standing there with that same casual stance he always used, like everything was going to be fine as long as he could charm his way through it. He gave me a half smile, and for a moment, I considered shutting the door right in his face, not out of spite, but simply because I didn't think I could hear another version of the truth that didn't align with what I had already discovered. But instead, I stepped aside, letting him in with a sigh and a wave of my hand. That said more than either of us was ready to acknowledge. We sat in the living room, and he looked uncomfortable in the way someone does when they're about to say something that costs them a piece of their dignity. He didn't start with an apology, of course. Not Ryan. Instead, he led with, "Look, I didn't know Dad used your name for that loan. I swear I didn't." His voice was low, like he was afraid the walls might tell on him. I watched him carefully, trying to see if there was guilt in his expression or just fear of consequence. But it was hard to tell with Ryan. He'd been the family favorite for so long, he'd become an expert at softening the edges of his accountability. I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until he had to look away, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when things got tense. Finally, I said, "Do you really expect me to believe that you didn't know? That Dad just went rogue, forged my name, took out a loan to help your business, and you never questioned where the money came from?" His eyes flicked back to mine, and for a split second, I saw it, the hesitation, the guilt, the awareness that maybe he hadn't asked too many questions because the answers were always just a little too convenient. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said, "I didn't know the details. I knew there was help, but I thought it was from Mom. Or maybe they had some savings left. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. Not really." That was the first honest thing he'd said all night, and I felt it land in the pit of my stomach like a stone. That right there, that willful ignorance, was worse than lying. At least a lie has shape. But choosing not to ask, choosing not to know, is a way of keeping your hands clean while the rest of us are out here scrubbing the blood off the floor. I asked him how long he'd been living in that condo downtown, the one under their name, the one I knew for a fact they were still paying property tax on. He shrugged, like it was just another detail. Since last year, after the last startup folded. Another shrug, another deflection. I needed a place. They said it was fine. Of course they did. Because for Ryan, there was always a net. Always a soft place to land. And when that net had holes, someone, usually me, was expected to stitch them shut without complaint. It all started to feel like some twisted family tradition, one where I was cast as the dependable one, the workhorse who didn't need praise or recognition, just kept her head down and handled whatever crisis came next. Ryan got the spotlight, the benefit of the doubt, the excuses. I got the bills, I got the responsibility, I got the silence. Then he said something that made the room go colder. "Dad's not well, Julia. He's been forgetting things, getting confused, angry for no reason. Mom didn't want to tell you, but it's been getting worse. He's not the same." I stared at him, unsure whether this was a manipulation or a revelation, and I hated that I couldn't immediately tell the difference. The idea that Dad might be losing his grip on reality made my stomach twist. Not out of compassion, but because it would mean everything I was holding against him might come with an asterisk. It would mean the man who forged my name and humiliated me in front of the family might not even fully remember doing it. But Ryan wasn't finished. "He's paranoid. He thought the bank was after him. That someone was setting him up. That's why he used your name. He said it would protect us." The absurdity of that statement almost made me laugh out loud. But all that came out was a bitter scoff. Protect us? From what? From accountability? From his own incompetence? From the consequences of a lifetime spent dodging blame and rewriting the story so he always came out on top? I asked Ryan why no one told me, why Mom had called me for money but never mentioned Dad's decline. He looked at me like I should already know the answer. "Because you're the strong one. You always have been. She thought you'd handle it, like you always do." And there it was, the rot at the core of our family tree. Strength had never been a compliment. It had been a sentence, a role assigned and expected to be performed endlessly, without gratitude, without recognition, without any consideration for whether I had the capacity to carry it all. I stood up, needing to move, needing to break the tension coiling around my spine. I walked to the window, staring out at the traffic below, the city alive and moving while I stood frozen in a storm of truths too heavy to hold. Behind me, Ryan was silent, letting the weight of everything settle into the space between us. Eventually, I turned back to him and asked, "So what now? You want me to keep quiet again? To sweep this under the rug so Dad doesn't get embarrassed? So Mom can pretend everything's fine? Or are we actually going to deal with the fact that our parents have been using me like an ATM with a guilt complex? Ryan didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, for once without the smirk or the cocky tilt of his head, and said, I don't know, but maybe it's time we stop pretending you're just the backup plan. Because if you walk away from all of this, I don't think any of it holds together. And he was right. But that didn't mean I was willing to stay. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the opened manila folder in front of me, its contents laid out like a crime scene. Bank statements, tax records, credit reports, all stitched together with a web of annotations I'd scribbled in red pen through half a pot of coffee and 3 hours of mounting disbelief. I had marked every instance my name appeared where it shouldn't have been, every discrepancy that had gone unnoticed, because I had trusted the people who raised me to tell me the truth. The deeper I dug, the more it felt like I had never really known the inner workings of my own family. I had believed in a version of us that existed mostly in holiday photos and half-remembered stories. And now that illusion was breaking down line by line on paper that crackled when I turned it, like it resented being disturbed after all these years. When I finally met with Mark later that afternoon, I was already vibrating with nervous energy, the kind that sits in your bones and makes your skin feel too tight. We met in his office, a small but tidy room filled with casebooks and framed degrees, none of which made me feel any better about what we were discussing. I handed him the folder, and he took his time flipping through it, his brow furrowing deeper with every turn of the page. He didn't speak right away, just gave these small hums of understanding, the kind lawyers give when they're mentally building a list of liabilities. When he finally leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, he didn't mince words. Julia, this isn't just financial mismanagement. This is a series of coordinated deceptions that clearly implicate your father, and possibly your mother, in ongoing fraud. If we pursue legal action, we're not talking about small claims court. This could escalate fast, and if you report the loan forgery, it could carry criminal penalties. That last part hit me harder than I expected. I had been furious, yes, but I hadn't truly considered the full ramifications of what it would mean to turn in my own father. I tried to explain that I didn't want to see anyone in handcuffs, that I just wanted it corrected, acknowledged, made right. But Mark looked at me with that familiar expression people get when they're trying to gently point out how naive you're being without using the actual word. Intentions don't matter much to the law in a case like this, he said. Either he did it or he didn't. If you push this, there's no way to stop the boulder once it starts rolling downhill. So before you take another step, you need to ask yourself, are you ready to burn that bridge? Because it won't be just your dad standing on the other side. It'll be your mother too, possibly even your brother. I left his office feeling heavier than when I walked in. My brain was spinning, but instead of answers, I kept circling the same question. How far was I willing to go for the truth? Because the truth had a clause. It always did. And I wasn't sure I was ready to pay the full price of unraveling a story that had been written in blood, obligation, and decades of carefully managed silence. On the way home, I took a detour and parked outside my parents' house, a 2-story colonial with fading white trim, and a porch that creaked when you stepped on the far left plank. I didn't go inside. I just sat in my car and watched the windows, wondering who was sitting behind them now. My mother probably in the kitchen, tidying up a counter that didn't need it, fussing over invisible worries. My father, maybe in his recliner, half asleep in front of a muted TV, slipping in and out of lucidity. The house looked the same, but I couldn't stop seeing it differently. Less like a childhood home and more like a stage set, where each of us had played a role we didn't write, didn't agree to, but kept performing out of fear of what would happen if we stopped. That evening, I called my mother. I didn't accuse, I didn't shout, I just asked. I asked about the loan, I asked about the college fund, I asked about how many times my name had been used without my knowledge. At first she denied, then she deflected, then she got quiet, and finally when I said, "Please don't lie to me again," she broke. Her voice cracked the way it used to when she was trying not to cry in front of us as kids. "Your father was under pressure," she said. "He didn't mean for it to get this far. He thought he could fix it before you ever found out. And I didn't know what else to do. I thought if we told you, you'd hate us. That's what broke me. Not the lie, not the fraud, but the idea that they had chosen silence over trust. That they had decided I wouldn't be capable of love once I knew the truth. That instead of coming to me, they buried me in their guilt and dressed it up like family loyalty. She kept talking, unraveling more than I expected. Turns out, the loan wasn't the first. There had been a smaller one, years back, during Ryan's first failed venture. That one had been paid off, but only because they pulled from my grandmother's inheritance. The portion that was supposed to be split between Ryan and me, but had quietly been redirected when I was out of state and too busy working 3 jobs to ask questions. It had started as small things, bills here, tuition there, and grown into something monstrous, something with teeth. After we hung up, I sat in the dark, my phone still in my hand, and let the silence fill the room. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel anymore. I wasn't angry, I wasn't even shocked. I was hollow, like someone had scooped out the part of me that used to believe my family's dysfunction was normal, even charming in its own chaotic way. But now I saw it for what it was, a structure built on secrets and held together by guilt. The next morning, I emailed Mark and told him I wanted to proceed. Not with a criminal case, not yet, but with formal notice to my parents and the bank that the loan was unauthorized and that I was beginning the process of clearing my name. It was the first domino. I knew that. Once that letter hit their mailbox, the illusion would be gone. There would be no more dinner table charades, no more pretending we were just another flawed but loving family. There would only be facts, consequences, and whatever came after. As I pressed send, I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt like someone who had finally stopped pretending the floor was solid beneath her feet and decided to start building her own damn foundation, this time without borrowed bricks. 2 days after I sent the notice, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but I picked up anyway, half expecting it to be some robotic voice reading out legal jargon, or maybe a bank clerk wanting to verify a claim. Instead, it was Ryan again, his voice quieter than usual, lower, like someone had dialed down his volume out of caution. "I need to come over," he said. And for once he didn't offer an excuse or a lead-in. Just that simple sentence, stripped of all his usual bravado. I said fine, and within the hour he was at my door, wearing an old hoodie and the kind of defeated expression I hadn't seen on him since the day he called me crying. After his second company folded and our dad told him to man up or move out, he didn't even wait for me to sit down before he launched into it. "You're not wrong," he said, "about any of it." And just like that, the mask cracked. The smugness, the performative confusion, the careful indifference he wore like armor, it was gone. What was left was someone I barely recognized. Someone who looked exhausted from pretending for so long that the story he'd been telling himself still made sense. He told me that the loan was only the final straw. Dad had been unraveling for over a year. It started small, forgetting appointments, repeating himself in conversations, getting lost on the way to familiar places. But over time, it had turned into something harder to ignore. There were moments of clarity, sure, and when those came, he was still the same man we remembered. Sharp, stubborn, opinionated, but then they'd vanish again, replaced by confusion and outbursts and paranoid rants about how everyone was trying to steal from him, how the banks were setting him up, how even his own children were probably waiting for him to fail. I listened in silence as Ryan described nights where our father would walk around the house muttering to himself, moments where he couldn't remember what year it was or worse, moments where he'd call Ryan by another name entirely. And through it all, Mom had covered for him. She'd lied to the doctors, lied to the neighbors, and most of all, lied to herself, believing she could manage it alone. Ryan had seen more than he'd let on, but he hadn't known what to do with it. He had leaned into the lie because it was easier, because confronting the truth would have meant admitting that the man who ruled our lives with unrelenting control was now losing control in the most devastating, humiliating way. And then Ryan said something that stuck with me, even hours later when the apartment was quiet again. I know he hurt you, I know he used you, but I also think, in his own broken way, he thought he was protecting the family. It's just, he only knew how to protect it by controlling it. That sentence hit harder than I expected, because I had spent so many years trying to decode my father, trying to justify his behavior, explain away the coldness, the favoritism, the biting critiques that were always disguised as tough love. And maybe Ryan was right. Maybe somewhere in the twisted logic of our family tree, Dad really believed that holding all the reins was the same as holding us together. But that didn't excuse what he did. It didn't undo the damage. And it didn't change the fact that I had spent years cleaning up after messes I never made, bearing the weight of decisions that were forced onto me under the guise of family duty. I told Ryan as much, and to his credit, he didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "I know, and I'm sorry." That apology didn't fix everything, but it cracked something open in me. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Maybe even the beginning of something like closure, if such a thing existed in families like ours. Still, the road ahead wasn't clear, because the legal notice had landed. And now the machine was in motion. My parents hadn't called me since it arrived, but I knew it had been received because the silence had a different weight to it now, heavier, deliberate, like the calm before a storm. Then the voicemail came, late that night, just after midnight. I missed the call, saw the alert blinking on my phone, and pressed play expecting to hear my mother's voice, fragile and apologetic. But it was Dad. His voice was raspy, slower than I remembered, but unmistakably him. "Julia, Claude," he said, "if you go through with this, you're not my daughter anymore." There was no anger in his voice, just a strange kind of finality, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed in his head 100 times. "You want to humiliate me? You want to destroy this family? Fine, but don't come crawling back when it all falls apart." I sat on my couch, phone still in hand, listening to the message 3 times before deleting it. Not because I wanted to forget it, but because I didn't want his words etched into my memory, like some kind of family curse. That was always his way. Emotional warfare wrapped in statements that made you feel like the villain in your own story, but I wasn't playing that part anymore. Not for him. Not for anyone. I started writing a letter the next day. Not to send, just to get it out. It was part confession, part reckoning. I wrote about the lies, the pressure, the years of pretending everything was fine when nothing was. I wrote about the time he forgot my birthday and blamed it on work, about how I had clung to the memory of him teaching me how to fix a leaky faucet because it was one of the only moments I felt like he saw me. I wrote about the shame, the guilt, the silence that had become second nature. And then I wrote about the mortgage, the loan, the betrayal, and how I was done carrying the consequences of choices I didn't make. I didn't sign the letter. I didn't seal it in an envelope. I just left it on the counter, where I could see it every morning. A reminder that my voice had always been mine, even if they spent years convincing me to mute it. I didn't know what came next. Maybe they'd retaliate. Maybe they'd disappear. Maybe they'd beg for forgiveness. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't matter what they did. What mattered was that I had finally stepped out of the story they wrote for me and started writing one of my own. The day I drove back to the house, I didn't tell anyone I was coming. Not Ryan, not my mother, not even Tessa, who had become something of a lifeline over the past few weeks as the mess kept unraveling in layers I hadn't fully anticipated. I don't know what exactly pulled me back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe a need to see the wreckage with my own eyes. But I found myself pulling into the driveway around noon, sunlight reflecting off the hood of my car in a way that made everything feel washed out and too bright, like I had wandered into a dream I didn't quite belong to anymore. The house looked smaller than I remembered, which was strange because it hadn't changed, not in any real way. The paint still peeled at the same corners. The garden still looked half-kept. The wind chime above the porch still rang out that oddly metallic melody that used to keep me awake on breezy nights when I was a teenager and couldn't sleep because my parents were fighting in the next room. I sat in the car for a long time, watching the front door as if it might open on its own, as if someone inside might sense I was there and come running out with some explanation or apology, or maybe just the kind of honest conversation we never quite managed to have when it counted. But the door stayed closed, and the house stayed silent, and eventually I got out and walked up the front steps, my heart pounding harder than it should have for something as mundane as visiting my childhood home. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and something else, something older and heavier, like dust and disuse and memories that had settled into the floorboards over time. I could hear movement upstairs, slow and uneven, and then my mother's voice calling my name in a tone that was equal parts surprised and relieved, like she had been expecting me and dreading it at the same time. She came down the stairs with a softness I hadn't seen in her before, wearing an old cardigan and that forced little smile she always put on when she didn't know which version of herself to be. I didn't hug her, and she didn't ask why. We just stood there, two women tethered by blood and disappointment, unsure how to begin untying the knots between us. She offered me tea, and I accepted out of habit more than desire, and we sat in the kitchen where so many of our quiet tensions had played out over the years. At that same round table where she used to clip coupons, and where I used to do homework with one ear, tuned to the sound of my father's footsteps, waiting to see if he was in a good mood, or if I needed to make myself scarce. The tea steeped in silence while she fidgeted with the corner of a napkin, and eventually she said, "He's not well, Julia. It's worse than before." I didn't answer right away because there wasn't really anything to say that wouldn't feel either cruel or dishonest, and I wasn't in the mood for either. She led me upstairs after a while, her footsteps slower than I remembered, her shoulders more hunched, and I followed her down the hall to the bedroom where my father now spent most of his days. The door was open, and he was sitting in the recliner by the window, staring out at the backyard like it held a secret he had been trying to remember for years. He didn't look up when we entered. His face was thinner, grayer, the sharpness of his features dulled by whatever was now chipping away at his mind. I didn't speak. I just stood there, watching the man who had loomed so large over my life, now reduced to something brittle and small and frighteningly quiet. Eventually, he turned and looked at me, and for a second, just a flicker, something in his eyes changed. Recognition, maybe, or something close to it. But it passed as quickly as it came, and then he looked away again, mumbling something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. My mother stepped closer, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Paul, Julia's here." He didn't respond. She didn't push. We stayed in that room for a few more minutes before she led me back downstairs. I asked her if she had read the letter I sent, the formal one, not the handwritten confessional I had left on my own kitchen counter, and she nodded. She looked tired, not just physically, but emotionally, like the weight of the last few decades had finally caught up to her and was demanding back pay. "I don't blame you," she said. "You did what you had to do. I should have told you more. I should have asked for help before it got this bad." I wanted to forgive her in that moment. I wanted to say it was okay, that we were still a family, that we could fix things. But the truth was, I didn't know if I believed any of that anymore. Because forgiveness isn't a light switch. It's a process, and sometimes it's a wall you climb alone while everyone else stands on the other side, asking why you're not just taking the stairs they hid from you years ago. When I left, I didn't say goodbye to my father. I didn't feel the need. I had said everything I needed to say in that letter, and the man I had written it to might not have existed anymore, or maybe he never had. And I had just projected pieces of a father I wished I'd had onto someone who was never capable of being him in the first place. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, the kind of late afternoon shadow that feels like a curtain being drawn on a play that's run too long. I sat in my car again, hands gripping the steering wheel, and took a deep breath that felt both like an ending and a beginning. For the first time, I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything. Not my silence, not my compliance, not even my grief. I had carried the weight of this family for so long that I forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. But I was standing now, even if my legs still shook from the effort. Driving away, I didn't look back. Not at the house, not at the windows, not at the wind chimes swaying in the breeze. Some things are better left behind, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Because not everything broken needs fixing. Some things just need to be acknowledged and left where they fell. I don't know what happens next. Maybe they'll try to mend things. Maybe they won't. Maybe Ryan will step up. Or maybe he'll fall back into old patterns. Maybe one day I'll feel differently, or maybe I won't. All I know is this. Sometimes choosing yourself means letting go of the people who taught you not to. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most honest kind of love there is.